Hello, welcome to the stream. And today I'm pretty excited to show you some stuff which is related to Waypoint and running on ECS Fargate. So I don't know if many of you folks have been following along with reInvent, but you know, a little conference going on at the moment over in Las Vegas. I think it's maybe it's not very many people. It's like maybe 30, 40,000 or something like that. But showcasing some of the new and cool things that AWS have been working on over the past year, and of course, some of the really cool things that already exist. Now, one of those things is ECS. So ECS has been around for quite a while. Elastic Container Services. It's a kind of a scheduler that allows you to be able to run applications. Now, what I want to show you is a workflow that allows you to kind of do that whole GitFlow thing, which allows you to push code to GitHub and automatically have things deployed. Right. So let's start there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at HashiPoint Waycorp. All right. We're going to look at Waypoint. Now, what I want to kind of show you with Waypoint is I want to show you that you can actually even simplify something like ECS Fargate. So ECS Fargate is containers on demand. You're only kind of paying for what you're using. But what we want is a way that kind of takes away all of the ops out of the DevOps. We want a way that allows application developers like me to be able to push my code and in some instances to be able to just forget about it, not have to worry about the build process, the deploy process or anything like that. And to be able to have that, that sort of really nice workflow. Now, Waypoint was something that we announced back just last year, and it's something that's been kind of worked on and iterated on over all of that time. And it's in my humble opinion, like sort of a really good state right now. Something that for sure you can be running in production, if certainly without any sort of risk at all in dev or test. And there's plenty of people who are doing that. So let's look at that use case. So Amazon ECS. So what is ECS? So we already said Elastic Container Service. So in terms of the concept, what we have is we have a cluster. So here I have a Waypoint server cluster. It's running on Fargate. That means that the container instances, the application instances are provisioned on demand. You don't have to pre-provision any EC2 instances like the classic ECS instance. And, you just have these running tasks. So let's kind of like dig in. Let's look at this. Let's configure a Waypoint cluster. Let's deploy an application. Let's see how easy it is. And if you have any questions, it'd be my pleasure to answer them. So let's go. So what I want to do first, before I do absolutely anything, is I need to install Waypoint onto ECS. Now, Waypoint doesn't have very many requirements. The only real requirement that Waypoint has is you've got to have an existing VPC. And Waypoint install command that we're going to run, well, that I have actually run, because it takes about 6 minutes or something. I didn't want you to hang around and wait. But the Waypoint install command, the only real dependency is that you have provide it with the subnets. And the subnets are related to your VPC, which exists in your AWS region. So my subnet IDs are here. You can see them, subnet 077 and 47, and they relate to the ECS region West 1. So if I go into my ECS console and I go through and I look at, VPCs, you can see here that I've got my VPC and it's all created. So I'm not going to go through and show you how to create a VPC. There's plenty of much better tutorials around that. And to be honest, I create this using Anton's excellent VPC module. like it was pretty easy. I had a little bit of Terraform code. The repo that I will share with you has that in if you do need to create a VPC. But the VPC is pretty straightforward. This is just literally a bog standard VPC. It has an internet gateway. It has subnets. I haven't created any security groups or anything like that. It's, it's really sort of bog standard. And you can't see my screen because I didn't press that button there. Right, let's start that again. So the VPC that I've created is here. So it's a VPC, pretty standard VPC. I use the Terraform module to create it. There's literally nothing else in it. So you might already have an existing VPC, and in which case you can just use that. I didn't, so I've just created one. So to install Waypoint, and this is the first thing that we need to do, is we need to kind of set up and install Waypoint. Now, I'm just going to use the Waypoint server install command that you can see here. So the Waypoint server install command, let me just zoom that up for you. By default, just has a few parameters. So we're giving it the platform. So I want to install it to the platform ECS. Now it's automatically going to create this on ECS Fargate. I'm just specifying the server image and the on-demand runner images. So the on-demand runner I'll explain in a little bit, but I'm using the latest version of Waypoint 0.6.1. So you can configure this if you don't want to use the latest version. If you're use pin to a previous version, then you can use that and configure that as part of the CLI command. The name that I want my ECS cluster, because what Waypoint install's going to do is it's going to create any resources that are needed. So it's not just going to deploy the Waypoint server to ECS. It's actually going to create the ECS server for me, configure any of the security groups and the application load balancer. So it's literally doing all of this work for me, and it's going to give me a production ready build of a Waypoint on ECS. I'm specifying just the amount of CPU and memory. Waypoint doesn't need a great deal of resources assigned to it. Obviously, that depends on how many builds you're doing, how many applications you have, but for sort of a relatively small setup, I can get away with like very, very meager sort of CPU and memory consumption. Then I'm kind of specifying my execution role name. Again, I could have just chosen the defaults, but I'm just kind of highlighting this out because Waypoint needs to be able to create some IAM roles which allow the Waypoint server to do things like create resources on your behalf, because a Waypoint deployment will automatically create an ALB. It'll create tasks inside of ECS. So the execution role, either you can create that yourself and have a very specific IAM role and policy, or you can just use the defaults. The region, so I'm just using EU West 1. I'm going to install this into Ireland. You can obviously install it anywhere. And then the subnets. So the subnets, this is going to kind of whereabouts am I going to install the sort of the ECS server to be able to configure up the application load balancers, to be able to configure the security groups for the Elastic file system that's attached to ECS, and kind of all of those things. Again, Waypoint is managing for you, but yeah, it's kind of a pretty simple kind of minimum level of information that we need to specify here. So I've already run this. So what I do is I run this command. It's going to run the networking setup, creates a new ECS cluster, sets up EFS, an Elastic file system. It's found the existing IAM role, so it's just reusing that one. It creates all of my CloudWatch logs, log groups, installs the server, sets up the task, and provisions the ALB. Now, this whole process, it takes, like maybe 6 minutes or something. It's something that you use once. This is like your initial deployment. It's not something that you kind of have to do every single time you want to use Waypoint. And that's all set up. So I get this sort of message back from, let me zoom that back out. I get this message back from the install process, and the install process saying that everything's been successfully installed and configured. It's automatically created a CLI context for me. We'll kind of look at that in a little bit, etc., etc. But the important thing is that I can just run this command here, Waypoint UI authenticate, and that is going to open up the Waypoint, automatically authenticate for me and open up Waypoint in my browser. Now, one step I did miss, I've installed the Waypoint CLI on my computer already, and you can just get that from releases.hashicorp.com. So let's run Waypoint UI authenticate. So I'm going to run that. It pops up in my browser. Now, Waypoint is using TLS, so it's an SSL configured connection to the Waypoint server. We're using a self-signed certificate by default, so that's why I'm getting this message here. So I'm just going to click on the OK, I know what I'm doing button, and then we get through to the Waypoint projects page. And this is all good. So within 6 minutes, what I've done is I've got my ECS cluster all set up and configured, all my ALBs, and we can kind of have a look at those in just a second. And I'm ready to be deploying my first application. So what application am I going to deploy? Well, I'm going to do the classic hello world, because ultimately it's not about my code. What I want to kind of show you is the process. So I have an incredibly simple Go application, probably the minimum lines of Go that you need to write in order to create a web server in Go. And all we're going to do is we're going to output hello world v1. Now, this code is checked into bog standard GitHub repo, and we've got that set up here. And it's literally just a standard Go project. So, we've got this Go mod, which is standard Go. I've got git ignore, a readme, like literally there is nothing special going on here. The thing that is a little bit special is this waypoint.hcl file. So the waypoint configuration file. Let's take a look at that. So every project in Waypoint has to have a configuration file. So it doesn't matter whether you're deploying to Kubernetes or whether you're deploying to ECS or Nomad or anything like that. All Waypoint projects have this configuration file. And the configuration file is broken up into a number of different stanza blocks. So I'm giving it a project name. I'm just calling it Hello World. I'm specifying some configuration for the runner. And what I want to do is I want to enable Waypoint runners. So I want the ability to build within Waypoint, build applications within Waypoint. I can specify the data source of my project. So it's a Git repo, and I can give it the URL of the Git repo. If I had any configuration parameters, SSH, user pass, or anything like that, I can also configure those here. Polling. Now, this is important because what I want to be able to do is I want Waypoint to automatically build and deploy every time I push code. So we can have that specified there. Now, the application stanza, and this is kind of like pretty much the bare minimum of what you need, but the application stanza is what's related in my app. So nowhere in here am I mentioning that it's a Go application. I'm just saying use Docker. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my build using a Docker build. So Waypoint doesn't necessarily know anything about that. You can, if you choose, instead of using Docker, you can use the build packs, the open source build packs. But I'm just using the kind of the plain old Docker setup. So I have this use block, and I'm saying I want to use the Docker plugin for the builds. Now, once I've built my Docker container, what I need to do is I need to be able to deploy it somewhere that ECS can run it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a registry. So I'm using the registry stanza block, and I'm saying that I want to use AWS ECR, Amazon Container Registry, as my registry source. And I could be using Docker Hub. You can use any Docker kind of any Docker registry or anything like that. I'm just using ECR because ECR, I can obviously create those private images. that only the Waypoint server has access to. So I'm going to specify my repository. So I've just created this repository inside of AWS. And it's here. I've just called it HashiCorp dev hello world. We have the URI, which is related to my user account, and then the kind of the ECR details. I've got tag immutability so that I can kind of push multiple lattices to that. You can obviously configure that how you want. And yeah, I just created that earlier on. So Waypoint is going to do my build. It's going to push to the registry, and it's going to tag it latest. I can configure this how I want. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy it. So I can choose, again, a plugin for the deployment. So I'm going to choose that I want to deploy it to AWS ECS. All I need to do is specify the region. So that's a region where my ECS server exists, and that's the same as my Waypoint server, EU West 1. And then I'm specifying the memory that I want for the app. It's a simple app. 512 meg is absolutely fine. Again, bare minimum of options here. Just keep it nice and simple for the example. So we have our code, got our Go application. We have our Waypoint configuration file. Let's take a look at our Dockerfile that Waypoint's going to use for our build. And that's pretty straightforward. So anybody who's kind of familiar with Docker and with Go, this is kind of a standard sort of multi-stage build. So I'm just using Golang latest as my build. I'm copying my my root folder, which is kind of my repository here, into a folder called app, setting my work directory as app, and then I'm just running Go build. So I'm running Go build, switching off cgo. Linux is my operating system, AMD 64 is my architecture, and I'm just running the command go build and then output app bin server. So it's kind of like, very, very simple, very, very basic Go setup there. Now, the second part of this multi-stage build is the part where it actually runs the application. And that's this part here. So I'm saying from Alpine latest, and I'm copying from the build stage app bin server, which was the output of my go build command, and I'm putting it in /app server. And then I'm just setting the entry point for my Dockerfile to be app server. So this is a really, really simple kind of Docker build. And I could run this on my command line like so. If I go to the right folder, Docker build -t waypoint test dot. And you can see there, all it is doing is a very, very straightforward Docker multi-stage build. Now, this is exactly all Waypoint's going to do for me, but I don't need to install Docker. I don't need to have any of those bits and pieces. That's already pre-configured. So let's give it a go. So back over to our Waypoint project. Let's create a new project and let's get this all set up. So I'm creating a new project. Just click the new project button. I'm going to call it Hello World. Now I'm doing this in the UI, but you could also do this from the CLI, so you can automate it if you wish. But I'm just kind of showing you in the UI here, make it a little bit easier to see. I give it a name. Now, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to run my builds every time I make changes to Git. So how do I do that? Well, I connect it to a Git repo. So I'm going to check this, connect this repository to a project, connect this project to the project repository to the, you know what I mean, create project. First thing, what is the source URL? Well, the source URL is my Git repo here. So this is a public repo. So I'm just going to use HTTPS as my source repo. I want the head. So I'm just going to build from main. You could, of course, use any of the sort of the git refs for a branch or a SHA or anything like that that you want to do. But I'm just using the header. I'm going to specify the git source path. Now, in this instance, my source path is root, so I can leave that blank. In terms of authentication, well, I don't need any authentication. I don't need to specify username, password, or SSH because this is a public repo. But if you are running a private repo, of course, you can use those options as you need. Standard kind of way of doing that with Git is to use sort of SSH-based authentication. But this instance, no auth. Now, automated sync. Automated sync, I'm turning this on because every change I make to my Git repo, I want Waypoint to do a build. The Waypoint HCL settings, that configuration, where does that exist? Well, that's going to live in my project repository because I want to be able to make changes to that and for those changes to be reflected in my build. I could, of course, just store the Waypoint configuration on the server. I don't need to keep it there, but I think this is the simplest way to do it. Let's hit apply. So the application has been created. So the next thing that's going to happen is Waypoint is going to go and clone that repo. And we're going to see that, that start in just a moment. Whilst we're kind of waiting for that process to kind of kick in, let's take a look at the Waypoint server itself inside of ECR, and you can see some of the resources that it's created. So the Waypoint server is going to create the Waypoint server install that we ran earlier, creates an EFS. So this is a managed resource that Waypoint is going to create and set up for you. It's going to create the ECS instance, which we have here, the Waypoint server, and the Waypoint runner, and the Waypoint server. So these are two tasks. Now the server is our application here that we're just kind of running in the browser there. And the runner, now the runner is responsible for picking up these changes to jobs and automatically building them on Waypoint itself. Now the thing is about ECR is, with ECS Fargate, is that ECS Fargate doesn't allow you to do privileged builds. So I don't know if anybody's used ECS before, and specifically ECS Fargate, but one of the kind of the common build processes is that, well, we want to run our builds in a Docker container. But we can't do this kind of this Docker and Docker thing, or these Docker builds by default on ECS because, well, ECS doesn't have a Docker server. There's no kind of Docker server to be able to handle those builds, and we don't have the capability of running privileged containers, so you can't run Docker and Docker. So how does Waypoint get around that? Well, what Waypoint does is Waypoint doesn't need a Docker server to do the builds. It uses Canico. So Canico, a Google project, it uses a rootless method of running builds. So we'll be able to see this kicking off right now. So Waypoint has detected that my project, and it's synced everything. You can see now that I've got my app called web there. And that web corresponds to the name web that I've given it here. So what's next? Well, if we look at this, you can see that we've got a build. So Waypoint has automatically started building my application with Docker. And we're going to click into that, and we can see there the build. You can now see this streaming in kind of in real time. And you'll also see, which is kind of useful, that I've got an invalid tag. The image tag latest already exists in HashiCorp dev hello world and cannot be overwritten because the repository is immutable, because I set up my ECR repository wrong. But that's fine, because let's change this. So let's go over here and let's call this v1. So I'm going to push my tag v1, git status, git add, git commit, update image tag, git push. That's going to work its way over to GitHub. And what we're going to see here in just a second is Waypoint pick up that change and actually start to redo my build. So I've already, a little bit ahead of time in my demo, shown you how we can actually just push those changes to GitHub, and how Waypoint is automatically going to kind of pick that up. Now, it's just kind of polling it on an interval in the background, so it's not going to be a sort of immediate, but we'll kind of see that kick in just a moment. And while we wait, I can go back over to this ECS setup, and I'll show you what is going on. So how that build worked is that the Waypoint runner is sitting there and it's polling, and it's checking for changes in my Git repo. When it detects a change, what it does is it spawns an ECS task, which is going to be responsible just for running that build. And that's the on-demand runner capability that was introduced in Waypoint 06, I think. It might have been 05, but fairly recently. The build itself is going to do the whole kind of like Docker build process, but it's going to use the sort of the Google Canico, the sort of the privilegeless, serverless method of being able to build Docker, OCI images, which is kind of neat. And we can see there that's kind of kicked off, and we've got that build going. That's running there. So if we look just quickly over here at our tasks, you can see there's the runner that's currently doing my build. So this is kind of just the internals on ECS. You don't need to look at this, but I think it's interesting to kind of understand what the architecture is while we're waiting. But this build's going ahead now. You can see that all of the logs I can kind of stream straight out to the browser window here. So it's like a super nice, actually a super nice experience. It's just finishing up there. It's cleaning. It's just going to push my image. And it's just pushed it now to ECS. And it's automatically creating a release for me. So we're going to see that happening in a little bit. Well, there we go, like right now. So what Waypoint has is the concept of a deployment, and it is the concept of a release. Why do you have a deployment and a release? A release is the latest version of your application. The deployment, well, you can have multiples of those, because maybe I've got V1, V2, V3. I want to be able to kind of deploy. Maybe I want to check that the application is working through some automated tests or some manual tests before I actually switch the load balancer and make it public. So Waypoint has done that deployment there. That's just starting up. We can kind of see the application logs. And if I click this button here, right, that's really, really small, but this is giving me a specific URL that's only kind of specific for this one version of the application. And it's not something that you have to set up. It's something that you can share. And well, if you want to, I'll paste it in the chat. You can click on it. There's not a lot going on there, but you can kind of see this. Now, this is private to anybody who's kind of sharing this. If you want, you can disable this service. I think it's really useful. What Waypoint is also doing is Waypoint is creating a release. Now, a release is fronted by an AWS application load balancer. Again, it's automatically created for me, and if I click on this, it's probably not ready. Oh, wow, it is ready. So this is actually my public URL. And again, I can I can configure this up and I can do some stuff, change the domain and things like that, run AWS API gateway in front of it. I'm just doing the bare basics. But we've got that all up and running, and I literally haven't had to write a single bit of infrastructure code, which is great for me. So let's look at the application developer workflow. What is that app developer workflow? Right. Well, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm not happy with my application. And I'm not happy with my application because it says hello world. And I actually want it to say hello Nick. No, I don't. I want it to say hello YouTube. And I want to, okay, let's give it V2. So I'm going to save that code. So I'm going to save the code. I can go through my kind of application. If I had any tests, I'd run them locally. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new branch and I'm going to push my code. So git checkout -b feature hello YouTube. I'm going to add that, add my commit. And then I'm going to push it, and I'm going to create a new branch on my remote called hello YouTube. And there it goes, right. So my kind of my application development workflow, well, what that looks like is this. So it's kind of that standard GitFlow. Now, first things to note, Waypoint is not going to be building straight away here. And Waypoint isn't going to be building because I've only configured Waypoint to build on my main branch. But I do have that change here. So let's do the GitFlow thing. I'm going to create a PR, update the message. Hi, I have updated the message that the server outputs to something more suitable. Create the pull request. Now, if I have any configuration here to do any of my my checks and tests, they would obviously run. That can be kind of like tripped by any of your GitHub actions or any of the other sort of standard kind of plugins that you have inside of GitHub. I'm going to assign it a reviewer. Well, we don't have any of those, so that's going to be me. I'm going to just click YOLO, comment. I'm going to merge that pull request. And what's going to happen now is because those changes are on the main branch, we're going to see Waypoint run another automated build. And that will kick off in just a moment. Probably it'll kick off at exactly the same time when I lose a little bit of patience, start to switch over to the ECS repo to show you exactly what Waypoint creates when it's building an application. That's going to be now. So let's look at a running application inside of the Waypoint cluster. It's called web. Now, the name is, the service name is kind of the application name, and it's obviously got some randomly generated identification, which is specific for the Waypoint server. It creates a service for ECS, which points to a task, and at the service, we have an application load balancer. So the task, Waypoint is creating all of my task definition. Again, we're running on EC2 Fargate, so we're only paying for the resources that we're using, which is 512 meg memory, and we're using quarter of a CPU there. So it's really sort of configurable, but in this instance is very light. I don't have to pre-revision any EC2 instances. Task definition, generally, you know what, I've never really used ECS before, so I wouldn't have any idea how to kind of set any of this sort of stuff up. But Waypoint does it all for me, so I'm actually thankful that I don't need to worry about it. But you can actually dig in and see what's going on if you do need to. I don't think most people will. I think you're kind of living inside of the Waypoint UI. But again, I think it's interesting to see what's going on. So we've got that task running. Let's look at the service again. We can look at our service here. Waypoint has automatically kind of configured up the ports, given the container name, setting those bits and pieces. We've got our log groups, which have automatically been set up and configured, and we can kind of see those there. And we've also got an application load balancer, which has been automatically created for us. And if I look at my load balancers in the AWS console, you can see that here. So Waypoint ECS, and we've got our app load balancer. We've got our listeners, which are automatically configured. So we're going to have port 80, which is forwarding to our ECS service. We've got the target group. Again, all of this has been automatically configured. So I can see that here. It's obviously configured up the health checks as well. And we can see that that's healthy. And if I go over to, I did it again. If I go over to Waypoint, my build has failed because it's telling me that I don't have immutable tags. Well, I kind of know that, but thanks for everybody who's watching for, letting me know. Just let me fall flat on my face. I'm joking. Let me just shortcut this. Git pull. Actually, you know what? Let me double shortcut this. Let's go into GitHub. I'm going to edit this. This is the ultimate YOLO way of doing a deployment. Never do this for production unless you absolutely have to. Commit the changes. That's going to go. All right, and Waypoint will pick that up. So we're going to have this concept of these deployments and these releases. And in a moment, we'll see that we've actually got two deployments, our V1 instance, and we've got our latest release, which is kind of going to be pointing at our V2 or V4 instance. Let's have a look at some of the things that we can do with the Waypoint CLI, because everything that I've been showing you has been sort of through the UI, and I think the UI is like a really nice experience, but you do actually have the Waypoint CLI, and the Waypoint CLI can interact with the server. So when I did that server install, it said it created this context. So Waypoint context, there we go. You can see all of the various contexts that I've got installed and set up on my machine, because I've been using this a little bit. But the context is similar to like a Kubernetes config context. You can just point the CLI at a different context. The context and information such as the authentication to the server and the kind of the ability to perform like any of the interactions like a build or anything like that. We can set those commands running locally, but it's kind of taking the action on the remote server. So one of the kind of the common commands that you're going to kind of use, well, like maybe you want to look at the logs. So let's have a look at Waypoint logs. So I'm running Waypoint logs, and it's kind of just automatically streaming the logs from the default application because I only have one configured. And you can see that there. Now, if I look at some of the commands in there, then I can specify like just plain text output if I want to just kind of stream those. I can specify the project or an app. Since I only have one project and one app, like I can literally just let it use the settings it's picking up from my Waypoint config I've got running locally here. My latest build has actually gone, and that is just completing there. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a new deployment. in just a second. So Waypoint is just going to finish up that build. It's going to push it to ECR, and then we're going to get that new deployment. And that's just ticking off. Everything seems to take longer when you're waiting for it, but it doesn't take long at all. Oh gosh, let me shut my window and reopen. There we go. So we've now got two deployments running. This one is marked as degraded because the health checks aren't passing on this. But if I do use the Waypoint URL, that I can see that, you know, it's automatically deployed and it's reflecting the latest changes that I've just pushed. Now, if, you know, I can paste that into the chat as well, so you can all see that at home. If I can find the chat, I can find the chat. And of course, the original URL, well, that's still available. So we've still got version 1 and version 2 running, because what Waypoint is doing is Waypoint is going to deploy both of those and do a blue-green on them. And it's doing that automatically for you. So in we got this released yet? Let's have a look. There we go. So it's actually now running in production. And that's happened automatically just by kind of pushing it. But what if I want to, you know, interact with that? So we've kind of already looked at the Waypoint logs, CLI. Well, what other commands do we have? Well, we've got Waypoint release. So what does Waypoint release do? Well, Waypoint release is going to give me the command so I can do things like list the current releases. So we can see here we've got, well, I've got deployment 2 and I've got deployment 1. Now deployment 2 is currently in production. So what I can actually do is I can release a specific deployment. So maybe I want to roll back to version 1. So let's just do that. Waypoint release, deployment. I'm specifying that I want that as a remote. Again, all of this action, even though you're seeing it through the CLI, is happening on the cluster. The Waypoint's on-demand runners and the tasks are actually performing all of this work. And we will see in just a moment, once that completes, that we've now just released. So we've got version 3 of a release. Version 3 of the release, which when that just kind of points itself live again, is going to be version 1 of my deployment, my hello world. And that capability kind of gives me the ability that I can kind of do my releases, but if I need to kind of roll back to a previous version, or maybe I don't want Waypoint to automatically release the application for me, I want to do it manually, then, you know, I can kind of do that. I've got that full control. And there you go, you see, like, so it's automatically retargeted the ALB to point to the V1 application rather than the V2. And of course, you know what? If I want to put that back, I can do so. Now, one last thing. Let's look at another Waypoint command. So let's look at the Waypoint exec command. So what does the Waypoint exec command do? Well, it allows me to get a shell inside of a running application. So my Hello YouTube deployment that I just deployed, well, it's a little bit buggy. So I want to be able to do some diagnostics on that. So what I can actually do is I can grab a shell inside of that container running an ECS. So I can run Waypoint exec. I'm going to specify it doesn't have bash, so let's just do sh. And if I do ls, you can see that I've got a connection into my currently running container. So I can kind of do some diagnostics in there. PSA, of course, Alpine. PS-A, so I can see that the entry point and my application, the entry point. So what Waypoint does when it deploys your application is it bundles everything with a sidecar. So all of your application traffic is fronted by the Waypoint entry point. Why it does this is to give you the capability, like I have here, the ability to grab a shell into the container, the ability to stream the logs, and the ability to do things like inject secrets and configuration. Now, it's a completely transparent process, and it's not going to really harm the performance of your application, but it's kind of there. It's kind of one of the unique features that I don't have to configure. I haven't had to add anything specific to my Dockerfile or my Docker build or anything like that. It just works. And that's pretty much it. I think, well, I hope you'll agree that Waypoint and ECS is pretty, it's pretty excellent. I think where we're going with this and some of the features that you're going to start seeing rolling out over the coming months are going to kind of make this experience even better. There's capabilities around integration with sort of webhooks and things like that to kind of give you that pure GitFlow, very, very easy, no configuration other than very sort of minimal Waypoint setup that I hope app developers and operators alike are going to absolutely love. If anybody has any questions, 100% feel free to type them up in the chat. I will just share with you my example repo. It's super simple, but you're welcome to kind of take a look at this. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you really enjoy AWS reInvent, and please try it out. Give us a call on the sort of shout out on the Discuss forum if you're kind of using Waypoint or if you have any questions. discuss.hashicorp.com. And why is my computer not working? Never mind. But any other sort of questions, of course, you can reach out to me. I'm Sheriff Jackson on Twitter, nick@hashicorp.com. That's Nick, N-I-C. And thanks so much for watching. We'll catch you next time. Just hanging around for those last questions. There are none other. Are you sure that it was that simple? No questions. Going. Thank you so much.